Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about the ideal list of romantic violin concertos. Yes, violin concertos. Now, as some of you have mentioned in the comments section, I have been avoiding violin concertos, and there is, I think, really a very good reason for it. Here's the bottom line. This is the ideal list of romantic violin concertos, and I've found 7 of them. That's all there are. I'm not saying there aren't millions of violin concertos. There are, but I'm talking about 7 great violin concertos, really unambiguously good ones. That is such a small number. And how am I supposed to approach this? Seriously. One of the things I was thinking about, for example, was take like the Beethoven Violin Concerto, which technically is a classical violin concerto, but it gets lumped with the rest of them because it didn't become popular until much later in the century, and it's the first of the grand violin concertos in most violinists' repertoire. I mean, they may do a Mozart, they may do some early stuff, but basically, life begins with the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And one of the things you'll notice is that the great composers really only wrote single violin concertos. And if they wrote more than one, nobody cares about any of the other ones. It's really kind of amazing. It's an amazing thing. And it's so different from the piano concerto situation. Really, really different. I mean, think about it. With Mozart, you've got, 20-something of them, and that's where the repertoire begins. And then you've got Beethoven, who wrote 5, and then there's like the triple concerto and the piano version of the violin concerto, 7 if you want. Brahms wrote a couple of them. Mendelssohn wrote a couple of them. Then there's the Schumann and the Grieg and the Tchaikovsky. These are all standard repertoire works, and they're much, much more popular in a general sense than violin concertos are. That is, there are more great pianists out there than there are great violinists, and there are more works for them to play. And so you can look at, recordings of the piano concertos within a single composer or a single work. I could do a talk, for example, on the Grieg or the Schumann, even though it's only one piece by that composer, one piano concerto. The other thing is that a piano concerto has a lot more to differentiate it from one performance to the next than a violin concerto does. Why? Because piano is a much more complex instrument than the violin is in terms of what it actually plays, in terms of the writing for it, in terms of technique, because a piano, you're using all 10 of your fingers and the pedals, and you're creating a full mass of harmony in opposition to the orchestra. It is a solo instrument all by itself. The violin is only a solo instrument by extraordinary means. I mean, you think of the Bach sonatas and partitas, right? Well, there it is, the solo violin repertoire. It's by Bach. That's it. I mean, yes, there are, again, other solo violin pieces. But as a recital instrument, the repertoire for solo violin is teensy, 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 next to the active repertoire for solo piano. The number of great works for piano is huge compared to the number of great works for violin. And you can tell the technique of one pianist from another much more easily than you can in judging, moving between violinists. Violinists have a very characteristic sound. I mean, Heifetz doesn't sound like anybody else. Perlman doesn't sound like anybody else. That's true. But to relate their individual sound to their style of performance is really a very different thing, a very, very different thing. And so there are so many wonderful violinists, and they're all playing the same music, that it just doesn't make sense to me to do like a Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto summary, because the differences are so minuscule. And there's so many great performances. You'd sit there with a stack of them, and I have a stack of them, and just say, okay, this is good, 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 this is good. Pick the violinist you like. So instead, that's my reasoning. That's just the way I was thinking about it. I find the violin repertoire very, very hard to deal with. Also, violin concertos are much harder to write than piano concertos. That's why there are so few great ones. I mean, I will talk about other violin concertos of like the Romantic period within the context of the composers who wrote them. But these big repertoire surveys of them, they just don't make any sense to me. However, an ideal list, well, that's something else, because then I can shape the list in ways that I find interesting and in ways that will give you something to think about, and you can participate and come up with your own lists. And that way, I think we'll cover the repertoire in a much, much more productive way. And I hope you agree with me. So in any case, let's talk about the seven. There's really only 5 great romantic violin concertos, but I managed to get 7 by including Beethoven on the one hand and Dvořák on the other, which has recently sort of joined the crew. And I end with Sibelius, who is technically a little bit over the 19th century limit, but not terribly so. And some of you may want to add others like, Elgar and some other people, but that to me is a completely separate conversation. So let's talk about these 7. What are they? They are Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Bruch, Brahms, Dvořák, Sibelius, and am I missing something? Or 7, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky. Let's not forget Tchaikovsky, shall we? That's it. There's your violin concerto repertoire for the entire 19th and part of the 20th century. Amazing, isn't it? I know there are others. There are others I really could include. For example, there's Wieniawski. I think his concertos are just trash, but, they're romantic violin concertos, and people play them. There's Paganini. I like Paganini, actually. I really like Paganini. But, again, they're not generally, they're not considered great works. They're effective works. One composer who I think whose music really should be included is Saint-Saëns, because his 3rd violin concerto is a masterpiece. It's a great, great piece and a romantic violin concerto, and it's a first-rate piece of music. But again, it's not in everyone's repertoire. It just isn't. And there's things like the Symphony Espagnole. Oh God, my nightmare piece, which you can see in my Perlman talk where I talk about that. These are things, they're out there, they get played, but do they belong in that canonic list of great violin concertos in the same way like the Beethoven and the Grieg and the Schumann and the Brahms and the Tchaikovsky first and those concertos? I don't think so. I just don't think so. So in any case, let's talk about them and see where we are. Here are my ideal performances. Okay, for the Beethoven. For the Beethoven, I think that, there's an endless number to choose from. Perlman, Giulini. Oh, by the way, this is 7 different violinists. That's the game, folks. You cannot repeat a violinist. Not for any reason. Okay, Perlman, Giulini. Now, this recording I picked because, first of all, it's an unabashedly great performance. Everybody thinks it's a great performance. I agree it's a great performance. But beyond that, when this came out, Perlman had a reputation as kind of a shallow, virtuoso fireworks guy, not necessarily the deepest of artists. But, putting him together with Giulini was an inspired idea because Giulini always had a reputation as one of the deepest, most inspired of artists, even when he was boring, which he is not here, by the way. And what happened with this performance, it seems, is that they really, really worked. Everybody, they took it seriously and they developed a truly profound interpretation, one that has marvelous give and take between the violin and the orchestra and a real conception of the piece's, lyricism and its sort of Olympian calm, but it's never static. It never dies. It's a wonderful, wonderful performance. Beautiful. And it was not superseded by Perlman's remake. Big surprise, right? So that's the Beethoven, and it's just delicious. A wonderful performance. Next, we come to the Mendelssohn. Oh, God, there's so many recordings of the Mendelssohn. And so many people do it well. But I picked Heifetz and Munch. Wow. This is it's just a smoker. The finale is just, holy cow. I can't even begin to describe it. It's just You use all your food analogies: scorching, smoking, sizzling, sautéing, flambeing, charbroiling, whatever. Oh my God, it's amazing. And of course, Mendelssohn is perfect for Heifetz, because Heifetz was sort of the ultimate cool perfectionist. And Mendelssohn was the ultimate cool perfectionist romantic composer. And the Violin Concerto is so marvelous the way he plays it, with incredible precision and point, and it has a gorgeous slow movement too, because he has that quick throbbing vibrato, which is perfect in this romantic music. Wonderful, wonderful. And Charles Munch. Whoa, let's not forget Munch. He's great too. The Boston Symphony. Heifetz, that's the one. Next, what do we have here? Oh, the Bruch. I have the Bruch First Violin Concerto. Poor old Max Bruch. He died in like the 1920s. I mean, did anybody care? And his major works were choral works. I mean, I sat through a live performance of Odysseus. It was the dullest thing I ever heard in my life. Holy cow, it was boring. But, the thing about Bruch is that the First Violin Concerto is one of those pieces. He wrote 3. No one cares about the other 2. And everybody does it. And it belongs with the list of great violin concertos. It has, in the finale, one of the main tunes from the Alpine Symphony, which Strauss himself acknowledged. He's like, then we get to the Bruch Violin Concerto when he was talking about it. Da-da, 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 da-da. That's in the slow movement, I think, of the Bruch Violin Concerto. Anyway, I am not picking the usual culprits for the Bruch. This is a magnificent performance, and I want to, I've designed a couple of these to show that, again, there are wonderful, wonderful modern recordings. They continue to make them. They keep coming out of this music with great, great young violinists, or people who are not Heifetz, Perlman, Milstein. There's just a lot of them. So this is a mix of old and new, and I hope it's an interesting one. And I encourage you to do that too. When you make your picks, I think you should try and include some people who aren't dead. That would kind of be nice, wouldn't it? Here we go. Vadim Glozman with Andrew Litton, and this is Bergen, right? Yeah, sure, the Bergen Philharmonic on Bis. Glozman is a stellar violinist. This is a stellar performance. It's magnificently recorded, magnificently played, and it's such a lovely concerto. And what I also like about this is that it's an all Bruch disc. And, usually they couple it with Mendelssohn or something else, so you wind up duplicating everything. But you get his Romance in F major and the string quartet in A minor, which is from 1918 and is very beautiful. Bruch's chamber music happens to be quite lovely. And I hope to be able to talk about some of it, because some of it's really gorgeous. I mean, his best work actually might have been chamber music, not Odysseus, that's for damn sure. But this one on Bis is marvelous, and I hope you give it a listen. I really do. And now we come to the Dvořák. Now, the Dvořák I added because it's one of those pieces that, because the usual 3 or 4 great romantic concertos have been recorded so many billions of times, they finally rediscovered these violinists, the Dvořák. It was, of course, the province of the Czech violinists. I mean, the reference recording was the Suk and Ancherl recording of the Dvořák, which is marvelous. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but there have been some really great ones coming out recently. There was Hönig with Anne-Sophie Mutter. I'm not going to mention that one on my pick, but it could be. It's a knockout. The thing about the Dvořák Concerto that I find fascinating is that it suffered from the fact that he wrote it for Joachim, and Joachim never played it. And it had a very tortured history. One of the things about violin concertos also that sort of distinguishes them from piano concertos is that piano concertos began to be played by people other than their composers at a relatively early date. Violin concertos were the unique province of violinist composers, most of whom might have been fabulous violinists, but who were not such great composers. I mean, think of people like Spohr or Vieuxtemps. These people, they wrote, Vieuxtemps wrote a nice violin concerto. Viotti I like their music. Some of it's really lovely, but it's violin music for violinists. And it's very difficult, very, very difficult. It was considered very difficult, especially in those days, for a strolling violinist to start playing music by another violinist, because violinists regarded it as proprietary. They didn't want other people to play it. Second of all, violin technique was an evolving thing, even more than piano technique was, and a lot of it was considered very personal to the violinist in question. And so other violinists didn't touch it. It was easier for them to write their own stuff that was designed to, support their own abilities as a soloist. Specifically, some of them had special techniques. They did tremolos, they did something, they did, Paganini was full of those kinds of effects, harmonics, And so they would write concertos for their own particular arsenal of virtuoso techniques. The piano was never quite like that. Maybe because, it was harder to carry one around with you. And, you weren't wedded to your instrument the way violinists become wedded to their violins. There are a lot of reasons for it. But the bottom line is that Dvořák concerto was ignored because it was never played by Joachim, and because it was considered to be, as so much Dvořák, sort of second-rate wannabe Brahmsian. But the Violin Concerto was considered a particular failure. And the reason it was considered a failure is because the first movement is not a complete sonata movement. It starts as one, and it gets to the recapitulation, and then segues without pause into the slow movement. I happen to think, Dvořák's publisher, everyone told Dvořák, no, you've got to write a big, long concerto first movement. And Dvořák refused. He flat out refused. And this was adduced as evidence of his formal defectiveness, which is just absurd, because not only is the piece not formally defective, it is formally masterful. Dvořák was so right, and everybody else was so wrong. Because what do you get? You get a violin concerto in 3 perfectly balanced movements. Classical concertos usually have a big, long first movement and then 2 short ones. The Brahms concerto, first movement's 25 minutes long. The rest of the whole concerto is less than, is 20 minutes, maybe, right? The Dvořák has 3 movements, 9 or 10 minutes long each. They balance perfectly. And the most wonderful thing about it is that the finale, which is usually the kiss of death in romantic concertos, is absolutely fabulous. It's like the best part. He saves the best for last. There is no decline in activity or interest or melodic fecundity or any of those things as the piece plays. And the finale is marvelous. Absolutely. God, what a great tune. Ba da 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 blah blah. It's great. Great. And the end is like just brings the house down. Why it is that it's taken so long for this piece to overcome the prejudice. It's just what it was. It was prejudice, nationalist bias, call it what you will. It's taken so long for this work to come into its own, but it has. And for that reason, you tend not to find many, many recordings that were acclaimed as the ultimate by the early violinists. Milstein did it fabulously well. There's one earlier version, but the most recent performances of it, I think, are the best. I really do. And so I've chosen for this particular talk Christian Tetzlaff. Who's he with? Oh, John Stuargart's in the Helsinki Philharmonic. This is just a knockout. It's on Ondine. And I picked this one over, for example, Anne-Sophie Mutter because of the coupling. Because the coupling is Joseph Suk's Fantasy for Violin and Orchestra, which is a concerto-length masterpiece. Absolutely a masterpiece. A great, great piece for violin and orchestra. And you should have them both. And this is a fabulous way to get them. Absolutely fabulous. Beautiful, beautiful performance of the Dvořák, and coupled with the Suk, it's hard to beat. Really hard to beat. I find it astonishing, really. It's taken so long for this concerto to come into its own. It's Dvořák. How bad could it be? Even if it was, it's great. Absolutely great. And it belongs to be ranked with the great romantic violin concertos. So now we come to Tchaikovsky, the one everybody and their mother does. I never much liked the Tchaikovsky. That's not a piece of his that really appealed to me. Because I find it to be kind of too violin-y. You know what I mean? It's full of like double stops and things. And the finale, it sounds like you're sort of tearing at the violin. It needs to be played, I think. It can be vulgarized very, very easily. And so it needs to be done as a piece of elegant, classy, polished, beautiful music. And those double stops, the damn double stops in the finale, they better be in tune. It's bum ba dum bum 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 bum. I mean, it can sound like there's no music happening there. I want to hear actual pitches. I want to hear the notes, and I want them to be played like in tune. I want them to sound like a melody. Well, so Nathan Milstein's your guy. He was the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto guy who redeemed the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. I saw him do this several times, and he was absolutely owned the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto when he was at his peak in his lifetime. This was his last recording of it with Abato. It's marvelous. It's coupled with the Mendelssohn, which is also marvelous. But with Milstein, you listen to the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, and it sounds like the great piece of music that it really, really is. And I just love the performance. I really do. It's a performance that so does not take it for granted. And that, to me, is just critically important. It really is. Next, we come to the Brahms Violin Concerto. And here, see, I could have picked a modern one. I would have picked, if I had to pick a modern one, it would have probably been also Gil Shaham with Abato, but because I already just used Abato, I thought we'd go with one of the more classic ones. Shall we? Let us. Oistrakh and Zell. See, Oistrakh did it twice. He did it also with Klemperer. And how do you pick between Oistrakh, Klemperer, and Brahms, and Oistrakh, Zell, and Brahms? But the Klemperer is the one that's better known, so I picked the one with Zell. And it's also harder to find because Oistrakh and Klemperer was always in print, and Oistrakh and Zell, it was just out there somewhere. EMI never re-released it. Now, of course, it's in a bunch of Oistrakh boxes, and there's a Zell Warner collection coming out, which will have this in it. And you really must have the Oistrakh Zell Brahms Violin Concerto. It's a knockout. It's absolutely amazing. What is there not to love in that combination of people doing Brahms? It's really unbeatable. And finally, we come to the Sibelius Violin Concerto. Now, the Sibelius Violin Concerto recently has been played in its original unrevised version, which demonstrates so clearly that composers usually knew best when they revised things, because the revised version is wonderful. Now, here's the thing about the Sibelius. Everybody does it. It's very, very difficult violin concerto to carry off successfully. It requires amazing coordination between the violin and the orchestra. The thing that's so cool about the Sibelius Violin Concerto is that it doesn't sound like a violin concerto. It sounds like Sibelius. And one of the things that always amazes me about the Sibelius is just how beautifully it's set for violin and orchestra. It's so hard to write for the violin in a full orchestra because, it's a little violin and the orchestra could just overwhelm it without even trying. And, so most composers, when they write violin concertos, lighten the scoring as much as they can, and they have to be very careful. And Sibelius is amazingly so, because there's like nothing in the orchestral part that rises above middle C. It's amazing. The whole orchestral part is so dark in the string section. It only gets lighter and brighter occasionally in the winds, the flutes and clarinets. That's where the sunshine is in this violin concerto. And, of course, the solo violin. So that means every single note. The end of the first movement, of this concerto is one of the most amazing pieces of orchestration in the history of music. I'm not kidding, because you hear the entire orchestra sort of going nuts. Boo doo doo, boo doo boo boo boo, you know, do 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 do. I mean, it's just tumultuous, roiling, storm of an orchestral tutti, but you hear every single note of the solo violin. It's even the last note of the whole thing, like that, Wow, it's just incredible how Sibelius does it. It's a clinic in what to do when you're writing a violin concerto, but no one else can do it, because what makes it, sound like Sibelius is what Sibelius is doing to make the violin part audible. It's extraordinary. But because the orchestral part is so dark, and because the violin is so exposed all the time, you can hear performances where it sounds like the two of them are playing totally separate pieces of music. I mean, they never get together. I saw a recording. It was in Fisher Hall. It was with Joshua Bell and Slatkin, conducted in the New York Philharmonic. And he played beautifully. Slatkin conducted beautifully. It sounded like the two of them could have been in different worlds playing different pieces. It was so weird. It never came together. And, I've done this in, community orchestras several times, which is always a mistake. You'd think it's very simple because the orchestra is just accompanying the violin. It's not. It's really hard to coordinate and make it work. And so I think, we tend to take this concerto for granted. The fact is, I think that's the reason for a long, long time it was neglected. It was Heifetz who popularized it. And of course, I already mentioned him here with this handy little Heifetz conductor, plays great violin concertos. I mean, you could have this for all of these concertos. So, I mean, you're going to be in good shape. And his Sibelius is amazing. He did it a couple of times. But I have chosen for the Sibelius Victoria Mullava with Seiji Ozawa. I love Victoria Mullava's violin playing. She is another very serious Russian violinist, Very serious Russian violinist type, I love her stuff. And her Sibelius, it's with Seiji Ozawa. It has, first of all, the right coordination between solo and orchestra, but she plays with a big, dark, sultry, sexy kind of tone that I think is just ideal for the Sibelius concerto. I don't want to hear a thin, light, fluffy Sibelius concerto. I think it should sound Russian. It should sound dark. It should sound, passionate and expressive. The beginning of that, of the cadenza in the first movement, it's, wah, the violin's just screaming. Oh, God. Wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful performance. And, and the finale can sound a little bit lightweight, I think, but it shouldn't. It has to bum ba-dum bum bum wah 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 dum ba-dum bum 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 bum. Again, I want to hear the darkness in the music. I really do. I want to hear all the things that make it sound more like Sibelius and less like some sort of throwaway virtuoso violin concerto. And I think Mullava does that superbly well. Now, there are wonderful recordings by Finnish violinists. There's Heifetz. There's, lots of people out there who've done an excellent job with it, really. But those are my performances. And let's run through for the romantic violin concertos, my ideal list. Again, the list that has no weak performances and features 7 works by 7 different violinists. And that is your challenge when you come up with your list. Again, Beethoven, Perlman Giulini, Mendelssohn, Heifetz Munch, Bruch, Glozman Lytton, Dvořák, Tetzlaff Storgards, Tchaikovsky, Milstein Abbado, Brahms, Oistrakh Zell, and finally, Sibelius, Mullava Ozawa. Great stuff. Great violin concertos. I'm so happy that I was finally able to find a way to talk about some violin concertos. We'll talk about more of them. There's more coming. Don't worry, we'll get there. But at least this gets us started, I think, and for collectors who are beginning These are the works you need to have. This is one list of performances you should consider. And I think you could also look at some of the other ones that will doubtless be coming along from you out there, my trusty commentators. Thank you so much for listening. Keep on listening. There's a lot of really fine music for violin, a lot of it totally unacknowledged because violinists don't want to learn it still. They tend to be rather conservative in their selections, but we are listening, and maybe we can effect some change if we're loud enough about it. Thank you, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.